pop up. Okay, so the very first module in our course is just an overview of the architecture overview, just an overview of architecture as a concept. And this is meant to really ground a little bit of idea on what architecture is all about, what it isn't, okay? And it's really meant to set the tone and the context as to why uh, architecture is an important idea or concept when it comes to IT, especially implementing systems, implementing solutions with companies, with businesses, with large enterprises. Okay, so we will try to, hopefully, by the end of the module, you will be able to explain a little bit on what architecture is all about, know the difference between architecture and design. There are some similarities, there are overlaps, but they're really distinct from one another, and we will see that in a little while. And we hope that after the module, you are able to explain why architecture is important for your clients, for our clients. By clients, we could mean our customers. By clients, it could mean that if you're on the IT team of a company, that would be your other employees within the same company. So that's the reference for clients. So it could be external clients or it could be internal clients. Now, what do we mean by architecture? Well, architecture is really some sort of a scaffolding that provides some support in terms of understanding decisions and commitments about particular options. So, roughly, you can look at it from the perspective of, well, some sort of an outline or some sort of a skeleton or some sort of a blueprint. I mean, these examples, these metaphors are actually valid in explaining what architecture is in the concept of IT or in the concept of solution architecture. And the reason why it's important that you'd have some sort of a scaffolding, skeleton, blueprint is that you'd like to be able to really address these issues that's in front of you. So, what are the critical questions? What has to be done a particular way to solve a customer's problem? What has to be decided now and what can be left for later? Now, you can see here from these three questions some elements that are key in making architecture work for you. So, one is knowing that there has to be a problem to be solved. Okay, the architecture is meant to actually give people, the clients in particular, an idea on how to solve a problem whenever a problem crops up. Architecture is sometimes or most of the time brought about because there are problems that needed to be solved. But even if problems have already been solved, the architecture is still valid. Okay, it's still useful, so that when other future problems crop up, okay, architecture can still be useful, and you can still solve those problems. So, really, architecture, while it can be born out of the immediate need to solve an existing problem, it can persist even after the problem has been solved in order to preempt the possibility of future problems that might crop up. So, and if they do crop up, then you have something to work on. So that's the first key element that I'd like everyone to appreciate about architecture. Okay, it's meant to help solve problems. Okay, now architecture, another key element in architecture is deciding what is important and what is not important, right? It helps provide scope, and you will really appreciate it better if you see you try to cover things that are really important to you, But things that are not important to you, you know that you can ignore them, you can dismiss them. And that's the beauty of architecture. You're clear with your scope, right? And more often than not, I mean, the decision for your scope is an important factor already in itself. So you're making an intelligent choice as to what is really important to you, what is really important to the organization, to your client. Okay, and everything that is not really important, everything else is not really important, you can set it aside, leave it for later, or really ignore it. Okay. Now, we're going to discuss architecture in the context of IT, in the context of enterprise architecture. We're not going to talk about architecture as what we know, like buildings, houses, and the like. However, the analogy in this traditional definition of architecture is very useful for us to appreciate and understand it in our context in IT. So don't dismiss it right away, but just to let you know, this is different from architecture, what you know, like the arches, the monuments, the things that scale up. So houses, buildings, okay, skyscrapers, they're completely different. So architecture is the fundamental organization of a system embodied in its components, the relationship to one another, and to the environment and the principles guiding its design and evolution. Okay, so this is the more technical definition of architecture in our context now. And if you're going to unpack the idea, well, the architecture is supposed to be a description. The definition uses the phrase fundamental organization. So it's fundamental, it's root, it's key, it's important. Organization, it is a conceptual way of putting order. Order of what? Okay, well, the system, its components, the relationship with one another, and the environment outside of the system. So that's architecture. Architecture is an orderly way of describing these elements: your system, the components, the relationship of the components with one another, and things that are external to the system that will affect the system. Okay, so that's architecture. Now, and there are many manifestations. There are many articulations of the architecture. Later on, you'll find that out as we go through the course. But at least from a conceptual definition point of view, that's architecture. And that's how it is. Okay. So what's the difference between architecture and design? And these are some differences. Okay, some elements that you will notice that will differentiate architecture by design. Okay. In a nutshell, you'll probably think of architecture as something much larger, and design would be something that's like a subset of architecture. Okay, it could be the entire architecture. Okay, but the design is more of the incarnation, so to speak, of something abstract like architecture. Okay. So here you see essentials dictated by need. Design refers to choices compatible with architecture. Different architectures imply different needs. Okay, and many designs, however, when you talk about designs, many designs may address the same need. In fact, many designs can be rooted from the same architecture. And you'll see the difference between the architect and the designer. So the architect is mostly, the role of the architect is mostly to make correct inferences. Okay, there's and really it's inferences because it's rooted in the fact that you're solving problems, right? Sometimes the problems don't have a clear-cut solution, and if they do, then you really don't really need an architecture for that. You just simply apply what you already know is to be the correct solution. But in most cases, when you're trying to apply a solution to a business problem, there's really no clear-cut and dry way to say that, okay, solution X is the correct and the only solution for this problem. No. What might work for one company may not work for another as well. So that's for me, that's what's beautiful about architecture, solution architecture. It provides you with the flexibility to know that, okay, unless you're very clear with the reality that you're faced with, you cannot be simply, how do we say this? You cannot be simply dismissive of the fact that okay, there could be how do we say this? There could be things that are not useful for you. Okay, and lastly, okay, architecture fitness for purpose. So you don't create architecture out of whim. Okay, you know that there's a need to be addressed. That's why you create an architecture. Design, on the other hand, the motivation is really to make things work really well. Okay, it's optimization, it's efficiency. That's usually what you see in these cases. Now, why do we need architecture? Okay, architecture is needed to make decisions on a bunch of these things. Okay, business processes, new business opportunities, how business can drive IT, and how IT can best support the business. So, if you've noticed, in each of the bullet points, there are two things that need to harmonize: the business and information technology. And that's the role of architecture. It makes sure that the connection, the relationship of the business and the IT is really in sync, is really in harmony. And you can describe it in this way: architecture is like the bridge connecting business and IT strategy. And this is where companies get to be a little bit more different compared to other companies, right? If they don't have a mature way of handling architecture, they won't be able to capitalize the power and the benefit of IT. Okay. We see a lot of knee-jerk reactions in most companies. They think IT is just a matter of rolling out product, and then all of a sudden they realized, well, the product didn't really help them, and yet the product may have been very expensive. It may be a branded product, but it didn't help them. Why? What went wrong? Well, in such a case, they didn't understand what the business requirements were. Okay, what was it that the business really needed at that moment, and whether that product that they've bought, which would have been an expensive product, would actually address the need of the business. Now, one way to address that gap is making sure that you have that architecture. Okay, that you have that idea, that scaffolding that will connect business and IT. Okay, so the term here in the slide talks about synchronization, but more than synchronization, which talks about making sure that everything is aligned in terms of time, it's really harmonizing things. Sometimes business can provide inputs to IT, and then it funnels back. IT can provide inputs to the business. Okay. In fact, we see a lot of very good companies wherein their business and their IT are very integrated, and they weren't really born out of IT. A good example I'd like to share would be Amazon. Amazon wasn't really an IT company. If you think about it, it started with books. So they're a retail company, right? But because of their ability to understand how IT can really help with their business and how business can actually ensure that their IT will really flourish, okay, through the use of an architecture, okay, then as a whole, the company can move up to further layers of success, okay, as they go through with their lives in the company. Now, what are the results? Well, efficiency through IT, agility, okay, robustness. But the last point is quite important, and I've been harping about that earlier. Okay, the result that there will be an appropriate IT solution to address a business problem. Okay, so solution to a problem. Now, here are some trends or transitions, if you will, that have an impact both to business and technology. Virtualization is one of them. Service-oriented applications, infrastructure. You have the cloud, security. I mean, the bullet points that you have here are just examples that there are a lot of trends that impacted both business and technology. So it's up to us to really understand these trends Okay, to have a good appreciation of how they really operate, so that when we come up with an architecture that is suited for that company, at least we're not left out uh, with the possibilities of how these trends will really impact your architecture eventually. But I think, I mean, this is quite a busy slide, right? But the whole idea here is that there are a lot of trends, both in business and technology. I mean, right now you have social media. That's also a trend that is impacting both business and technology. You have the use of the cloud. You have mobility. So back then, when we were thinking of architecture, you didn't have smartphones or mobile phones with you. Now it's pretty prevalent. So mobility is there. The use of big data analytics, that's also a transition that's very key nowadays. Within your fingertips, you'd have access to a lot of cuts of data, depending on what you really need, in order to give you some support when you make your own decisions. So again, I mean, this slide is not really meant to be exhaustive in terms of what are the transitions that have impacted both business and technology. You just have to be aware that they're there. They're a lot, and if you don't respond to it, you could be left out. Okay, you'd probably have to address more problems than solutions, right? So here are some of the benefits of architecture for the clients. You can go through them yourselves. Okay. Um, the whole idea here is that architecture should make the life of your client easy. Okay, architecture should pave the way in order for your client to do its business easily, conveniently, effectively, efficiently. Okay. In fact, I would even dare say that if you have a very good architecture for your client, the business of your client would even flourish, would even grow. Right? I mean, that's business. I mean, I mean, perhaps you might be thinking, if you're in an IT company, that would probably make sense, right? But if you're like a traditional manufacturer, for example, a manufacturer of t-shirts or jeans, how will IT make you flourish? Okay, how will it lead to more t-shirts being sold or more pants being sold? Well, if you really do it correctly, you can actually make that happen. You can actually make your client, the business of your client really grow, if you have a very good architecture to begin with. Now, the benefit for the architect as well is, well, of course, aside from the fact that you get to keep your job, okay, or you get to earn money from your client, well, the idea there is that from a learning perspective, it gives you a tool that you can actually use to other cases, to other clients, okay, to other organizations. The reusability is there, right? And by forcing yourself, if you're the architect, to have something that is architecture, you'll know that, okay, this is something that I can use to really extract what the needs of the business are, right? So that's the idea, the benefits for the architect. So that's the end of the first part of the module. Are there any questions to that?
None po, sir.
None for me.
Okay, very good. So I will go and share the second part of this module. So ideally, it should be okay. So what is the scope of architecture? Okay. Um, Now, before we tell you what the scope of architecture is, right? Um, I present to you a pyramid, which is the typical way of how you'd look at an organization, right? In relation to the components of IT. So, encompassing everything would be your security. So, security is not exactly your bottom layer, it's like everything that encompasses your whole organization. And working on security is actually a profession in itself. So it can be pretty involving. Now, at the bottom part of an organizational architecture, so to speak, is what is known as the core infrastructure. So this would refer to the hardware, simply put, right? Your servers, your storage, your networks. Okay. And then on top of that would be your application infrastructure. Now, when we say application infrastructure, there could be a lot of things like your middleware applications, modules that communicate with each other. Okay, so even your enterprise level uh, software, okay, that tries to tie up everything. Okay, or your operating systems. This would be part of your application infrastructure. Okay, databases, that will also be part of your application infrastructure. Um, and then on top of that would be your applications. So the things that are faced by a typical user. Okay, so your usual, perhaps from a personal consumption standpoint, this would be things like you use in Office 365, for example, for Microsoft, or if you're using Google. Okay, for if you're doing Google, okay, other applications like what we're using right now, Google Meet. So there are various applications there. And then information. So this would pertain to data, to your analytics related to your data. Okay. And this information layer is supports the processes, the business processes. Okay. So of course there will be functions that go around. And lastly, at the top of the scope of architecture is your business strategy and objectives. So this is at the topmost layer. Now, infrastructure architecture. So there are different types of architecture. So the first type is infrastructure architecture. So this includes the core infrastructure. So server, storage, network, and your application infrastructure. So your database management system, your middleware, your workflow, APIs connecting. So the blue dotted oblong that you see is your infrastructure architecture. Okay. Now, in infrastructure architecture, you don't really concern yourselves with application. You don't really concern yourselves with information or business processes. If you're asked to do infrastructure architecture, it's really just these two layers. Okay? So that's one type of architecture. Now, application architecture includes applications, okay, so the front end side of things already, such as sales, customer relationship management, finance, payroll, inventory, and so on. You know? Manufacturing, okay, shipping, okay, so logistics. So these are examples of applications that are considered in application architecture. So this would be the light green oblong, just simply locating itself for applications. Architecture, application architecture rather, can mean just one application. It can mean multiple applications, provided they're just within that same layer of applications. Now, information architecture. So this would pertain to logical database relationships, your schemas, information hierarchy and precedence, data warehouses, business intelligence, data stores, and so on. So if you've had an opportunity to study data warehousing, so this is something that's considered in information architecture. Okay, so it's starting to be a little bit more design related rather than infra related, right? And where does it fall under? Okay, well, the amber or the orange colored oblong, okay, just takes care of the information layer. So information architects, nowadays you have data architects or even data scientists, they would fall under this layer. So their focus is really just the information layer. How data is structured, is presented, is analyzed, is manipulated, is processed. Anything around those areas, that is the concern of information architecture. Now, security architecture Okay, describes the way security measures fit together in the context of the enterprise architecture to meet the security objectives of the enterprise. So here it's okay, it's going to cover everything because it's security, but the focus is really just security, confidentiality, privacy, uh, trust, integrity. Okay, making sure that things are secure. Okay, so that's the concern of information security architectures. It's really just focusing on the, I wouldn't say layer, security layer, but really on the security scope or the security envelope. Okay, so that's the concern of security architecture. Now, we go now to solution architecture, which is pretty much the title of our course, right? So a solution architecture may include business strategy, business objectives, business processes. Okay. In addition to the other layers in our triangle, these would be covered in sufficient detail to enable the solution of a particular business need or problem. Okay. So solution architecture is a narrow cut across all of these layers, focusing on a specific solution. So that's solution architecture. How does it look like in our diagram? Well, the solid red lines that you see here, that's solution architecture. You see, it will cover all of the layers, okay, in your organization, but it won't cover everything. Okay, it will only cover those portions that are relevant to what? What is the specifier for the solution architecture? It's the problem. Okay? The problem that you want to solve. That is the solution architecture. Okay. So that's the scope of solution architecture. But notice it covers everything. It covers even security, covers business processes, covers business strategy, which is not covered by the previous architectures that we've talked about. So maybe before this class, you might be thinking, well, if I'm IT, I might as well go into something very specific. Okay, that's good. At the same time, there is an opportunity for you to be in IT that can cover everything. In fact, it's very important that you have the facility, you have the ease of understanding what the business needs, okay, and finding ways on how you can apply IT to those contexts, right? So there, and lastly, so enterprise architecture encompasses all of these layers, but only with sufficient detail to show how to enable the business. So it does not cover the same level of detail as a solution architecture. In fact, to enable the business, an enterprise architecture typically includes high level guidance for future definitions of a great number of solution architectures. Together, these solutions architectures encompass most, if not all, of what is necessary to enable a business. So you can probably look at this. Okay, this is green dotted circle or oblong, right? It encompasses everything, but it wouldn't give you as much detail as a solution architecture would. Another way of looking at it is your enterprise architecture can be a composite of many solution architectures. So you can like collect many solution architectures, which are very specific, very detailed. You capture all of them together. When you put all of them together and bring it up to a level of detail that is not too detailed, but just enough to give you a full appreciation of the business, that's called enterprise architecture. So that's how it is, right? Later on, when we will discuss a lot of the things on architecture, the techniques, the tools that's provided to us, you'll understand that solution architecture or how to create a solution architecture is perhaps the same as how to create an enterprise architecture. Okay, so the skills needed for both is practically the same. Okay, there's nothing specific for solution architecture or specific for enterprise architecture. The required skills would be the same. So it's just that the scope and the depth that is required will vary. So solution architecture, it is specific because it's meant to address a problem. Enterprise architecture, it's broad but maybe more shallow compared to solution architecture because your focus is really understanding the entire business. Okay, not understanding a problem, but the entire business. Okay, so that's the That's the focus of the enterprise architecture. And we end with this second half of the module. Okay, so I think I'd like to spend the rest of the period maybe answering some of the questions that you might have for these two topics. Do you have any questions? Do you have any concerns?
Me, sir, none so far po.
Okay.
Also me, sir.
Okay, okay. So sige, well, if there are no more questions, maybe I'll stop recording.